Live now, the lecturer in British politics at the University of Liverpool, Dr. David Jeffery. We thought we had a handle on this issue, Dr. David Jeffery, but now we're thoroughly confused. What is the Supreme Court going to actually decide this morning?
Well, you wouldn't be the only people to be confused by Brexit. So the Supreme Court is essentially deciding whether Boris Johnson's move to a prorogue Parliament was lawful. And as it stands at the moment, an English court has ruled that it was, but a Scottish court has ruled that it wasn't. So the Supreme Court will have to make the final decision.
So just help me out here. How much sway does the Scottish court have?
So Scotland, ever since it became part of the United Kingdom, has had a separate legal system. So the reason why we have a Supreme Court is to iron out these difficulties. So they need to decide one way or another, because we can't stay in a situation where the English legal system says it was legal, a Scottish system says it was illegal, because that's not how Parliament works to represent the whole of the United Kingdom.
Okay, so depending on what the Supreme Court decides, what does that then mean for the proroguing or the prorogation of Parliament and that deadline of October 31?
Well, if the Supreme Court says that the prorogation was legal, then MPs will carry on what they're doing now, which is, not activity in the Commons, but still carrying out their functions as MPs. And it means that MPs will have less time to debate in the House of Commons about Brexit or to scrutinise the government's Brexit negotiations. If the Supreme Court finds that the prorogation was illegal, MPs will be recalled instantly, and it will be as if they'd never gone away, which means that the government can be scrutinised, the government can be called to account in the Commons, and potentially more legislation could be passed that would tie the hands of Boris Johnson.
David, as just more broadly speaking now, as we were just referring to before we came to you, this is something that the public really decided on back in 2016 with that referendum, but it still sort of hasn't been carried out yet. So more broadly speaking, outside of the Westminster bubble, what's the vibe at the moment when it comes to, the voters, the public?
Generally speaking, things are broadly unchanged. Remain, according to most polls, has a slight lead in terms of if there was a second referendum, but Remain also had a slight lead before the last referendum. So essentially very little has changed. Most people are bored of Brexit, really, and they want it sorted one way or another. But you can ask the British public questions, and depending on how you phrase it, you'll probably get an answer that you can agree with.
And David, if the Supreme Court does uphold this prorogation, as you explained before, it means that MPs have less time to debate some of these substantive motions on Brexit. So is the effect of this, of what Boris Johnson has done and is trying to do, is that if MPs have less time, therefore the closer you get to October 31, it means that if there's no other motions passed, then there is a crashing out on the 31st of October, or does Parliament still have to approve a no Brexit deal?
No. So when Parliament voted to start the Article 50 process immediately after the referendum, which Jeremy Corbyn also argued should be done, that set in motion a legal process that the UK would automatically leave the EU at the end of a 2-year process. The UK secured an extension from the EU under Theresa May, but Boris Johnson said he's not going to do that. So this prorogation allows for Boris Johnson to have less time to be tied by the Commons. At the moment, the legislation that was passed shortly before Parliament was dismissed forces Boris Johnson to request an extension if there's no progress on a deal, if a deal doesn't seem likely. But Boris Johnson is, I imagine right now, working his hardest to find a legal loophole in that legislation. So at the moment, if the EU refuses an extension, or if Boris Johnson manages to get out of having to ask for an extension, we leave on October the 31st.
Okay,
there you go.
I think I've got it.
Clear as mud. David Jeffery, appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We're coming up, Australia. Oh, plenty more